but welcome to UDL Guidelines 3.0 Essential Updates and Practical Applications, the overarching changes. So this is going to be a four webinar series, and this four webinar series is going to be on the research behind the changes and the 3.0 and the expansions, as we like to say, and 3.0. So this first one is going to be the big ideas. Then we're going to go into each of the principles: engagement, representation, and action and expression. And we're going to have some time at the end. We're going to ask you to populate our chat with some questions you might have after you kind of hear from Shantae some of the big ideas in the research that has led to these expansions in the guidelines. And you'll have an opportunity to ask us some questions about principle by principle that we can use to then make sure you're getting what you need in the next webinars, because you have signed up for all of them. So welcome, everybody.
Yeah, welcome.
So chat box, feel free to anytime introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know who's here, where you're coming from. Ask a question. You can share an idea. You can quote something you heard, or you could share a link with your colleagues. And how you do that is you go to the chat box and there's a drop down menu, and you're going to want to click all panelists and attendees. That way, not only Shantae and Patricia and I see your chat, but everybody sees your chat. So go on in there and let us know who's here. Introduce yourself. We'd love to hear from you. And if you hear somebody, if you hear something in the chat, or you see something in the chat, you read something in the chat that you want to respond to, you can use that little at button, and then use that person's name and respond directly to them in that chat box. So you can say, "Oh, I really like that idea," or "Wasn't that great?" So welcome everybody. We got some chats coming through already, I see.
Love it.
Our accessibility commitment. So we've taken steps to ensure that this deck is accessible. So how we've done that is we used a tool to perform an automated check using Microsoft Office. We've checked manually to ensure clear reading order for screen reader users. We are going to provide the deck to you once we get that solved. Um, and that means you can personalize the experience. And we welcome any feedback on improving this experience as we go along. So my name is Melissa Sanjay. I am an implementation specialist at CAST. So I work with teachers and school leaders, district leaders, sometimes state leaders, county office of education leaders, regional office leaders, and on the implementation of UDL, not only in their classrooms, but school-wide, district-wide, statewide, thinking about how do we make all those places and spaces accessible to all of our students in a place where they can have agency in their learning. And I am based mostly in Boston. And again, like I said over the last webinar, I'm not in Boston right now, but I am based mostly in Boston. So I'm glad to meet you all. And that's my email. If you have anything you want to tell me or questions or anything, feel free to email me. I have with me Shantae.
Yes, and I love presenting with Melissa because she has such a vast array of experiences and is always with us from a different destination.
Where in the world
And
is
so, right,
Melissa?
we're in the world. That's what I always say. We're in the world with Melissa. My name is Shantae Singer, and I too sit on the professional learning team at CAS, where I do many of my things online virtually, but do support school districts and a similar group to Melissa as on UDL implementation. But I also have the privilege of sitting in the research and development department at CAST, where we do all things research, right? So help with design and do all grants, and not all, but some of them. But I get to have my feel in the literature, which is I geek out, right, on the reading, on the literature, and we'll talk a lot about that today. So super excited to be here with y'all and to continue our conversation on our enhancements of UDL guidelines
And I'm
3.0.
seeing
So
in the
welcome
chat,
everyone.
Shantae, we got Mississippi, we got Ohio, we got Canada, we got North Carolina, we got Brazil,
Yay, I
Baltimore,
see.
Yukon,
Woohoo.
Ontario,
And
UK.
Houston, I see. And I did forget to say that I am based in Bryan, Texas. So my fellow folks in Houston at Region 4, where I used to be a part of their team.
Nice. Arizona, Pennsylvania, shout out. Oh, I see a
New
Boston.
Jersey,
Boston College. Yay. Awesome.
Austin.
Welcome,
It's so
everybody.
great to see everyone here.
So just a little bit about CAST, the organization that is leading these webinars. And CAST is the author of the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. And our mission is CAST leads, inspires, and convenes a global community to design equitable, inclusive learning experiences through our Universal Design for Learning framework. So that's the mission that guides all of our work as we use these UDL guidelines. So before we really dig into the webinar, we wanted to set our intentions for a second. So we're going to talk about some of the changes, the overarching changes that the UDL guidelines or changes or expansions. I like to say expansions because they didn't really go away. Nothing really went away. We just added, but some of the overarching expansions of our guidelines. I want us to set our intentions and think about what is it you want to lean into today when you think about these changes. So our agenda is we're going to talk about the changes from 2.2 to 3.0 kind of broadly. We're going to talk about some structural changes. So the document itself has some changes. So we want to help you navigate that a little bit. We're going to talk about those big ideas that that the research team that was involved in expanding the guidelines that Shantae was a part of, that they big buckets that they found new research to enhance those guidelines and identity and bias and collective learning and using learner-centered language. So I could go into each of those buckets. As we go into thinking about that's what we're intending to do today as we move forward, I want to let you take a minute and think about which of these ideas do you want to sort of lean into. And so if you could put in the chat, since right now we don't have the slides, Patrice, if you could put in the chat the UDL guidelines.cast.org and then the key changes document so people can at least check that out if that's something they're interested in looking at as they set their intention. But I'll read to you some of these big changes in each of our buckets. So engagement, our first principle, engagement. Centering, affirming, and sustaining learners' interests and identities, emphasizing the role of belonging in teaching and learning, and addressing bias, threats, and distractions. So think about, is that something, either one of those, any one of those, something you want to lean into and think about? You can put it in the chat. You can write it on a notebook. You can talk to a neighbor if you're watching this with someone else. Underrepresentation, authentically representing a diversity of identities, perspectives, and narrative. Address bias in the use of language and symbols. Valuing multiple ways of knowing and making meaning. Cultivate understanding and respect across languages and dialects. Anything you want to lean into in representation, feel free to put that in the chat or hold it in mind. Action and expression, honoring and valuing a wide variety of forms of communication, centering and valuing forms of expression that have been historically silenced or ignored by addressing bias, and challenging exclusionary practices to build more accessible, inclusive spaces and systems. So just take a second, set your intention where you want to focus your thoughts today, where you want to focus what you dig into. You can put that in, as I said, put it in the chat, write in a notebook, hold it in mind, tell it to someone next to you. So as we talk about a universal design for learning, I'll tell you what the definition of a universal design for learning is, and I'll read it directly from this slide for accessibility purposes. Universal Design for Learning, UDL, is an educational framework based on research in the learning sciences that guides the development of flexible and accessible methods, materials, and environments that embrace variability, minimize barriers, and develop learner agency for all. So as we use that framework, the sort of cornerstone of that framework that we're talking about is our UDL guidelines. So we have enhanced these guidelines, we've expanded these guidelines, and Shantae is going to tell us a little bit about that, the changes from 2.2 to 3.0 as we get into the overarching changes.
Yes, I am. So the enhancements were actually released to the public at UDL Con on July 30th. of this year. And so it's still hot off the press, if you will. We're a few months in, and we've had several webinars and also a few sessions at UDLCon regarding some of the updates. Melissa, you can go to the next slide. So in addition to the enhancements that we'll talk on throughout this series, I want to remind us as a community that the UDL guidelines still provide common instructional language for design. And you'll see kind of throughout today that we have been more intentional about really highlighting the need for design. We also use the guidelines to really bring together or compile a summary of learner variability. So we're still addressing variability. One of the enhancements that we'll talk through explicitly today is now variability includes identity. And that's something that is a shift. This is also still a summary of the research. What makes it great is that we've expanded this research base. We've expanded the types of research. So in methodologies, we've looked at both international and global perspectives. We have incorporated many, excuse me, identities or varied identities of researchers themselves. We have varied the participants of the research, and we've also expanded the terminologies that we've used. And so it still includes, our neuroscience, our cognitive science, our learning science. That's the basis. That will always be the foundation of the UDL guidelines. But as we keep saying, we have enhanced, we've expanded, and we hope to continue to expand the research base that supports the development and the ongoing iterations of the guidelines. We still want to look at the guidelines as a tool for anticipating barriers. And like I said, again, it's the guidance. It's a guidance for design of learning. You could go ahead, Melissa. Some of this is a 30-foot view, if you will, or just a summarization of the specifics within the structural changes of the graphic organizer of the guidelines. And so for each of these bullet points, we will, I'll show you how each of these have been, how each of these look like on the guidelines. So you can go to the first one. So before, we used to have provide multiple means of engagement. And excuse me, what we as a team, as a community, decided was, when we say provide, it's very teacher centric. It's very, it's having the teacher at the focus and being able to present this opportunity for students with students. And so we wanted to change this word to design to amplify the co-design nature of the guidelines. So it's not just things that teachers or educators are providing. It's more of the creation of multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression, and co-design it with the learners who are in our settings. The other thing we've done is we have changed the word that used to be checkpoints, those bullet points that you see, to considerations. So we thought maybe, and the community said, not just us, right? It's not just cast thoughts, but it's really just to remember all of this is based on focus groups and advisory boards that we have had. But they said when we say checkpoints, sometimes that can be miscommunicated or construed to mean a checklist or check marks. And so we wanted to pull away from the idea that these things are in a hierarchical order or that if you can just check them. And so we thought that the word considerations would be a better way to emphasize what we're hoping learners and educators will be able to do in their design or input in their design. Next one. The next thing that you'll see here is that our roles have changed, and the previous role used to be internalized. I've already forgotten. I have to look. But what we've done here is we've labeled this executive function because we recognize that it doesn't just not just construed to a box. Actually, all of the guidelines, but specifically the ones at the bottom, really do encompass what executive function is, and so they've been labeled. That's what it's been labeled for that row. And the goal of UDL. So the goal of UDL used to be expert learning. And so now we want to focus on learner agency, which can be looked as an umbrella to expert learning. It still involves expert learning, but the word expert learning we found from our audience or from our advisory group that sometimes it's very contextualized. Sometimes in our international or global community found it very difficult to explain what that is, and it could be looked at as a very Eurocentric approach. And so what we have determined the goal of UDL to be is learner agency, which is purposeful, reflective, resourceful, and authentic, and strategic and action oriented. Which there is a webinar that will be solely focused on learner agency. And so, in addition, like I just mentioned, to the structural changes of the guidelines, there are some enhancements conceptually that have also been a part of the overarching enhancements to the guidelines. Melissa mentioned some, as you saw in the checkpoints, but those big themes really are that we want to include center, affirm, and sustain learners' interests and big identities. So variability, we've always talked about since the conception of UDL. Variability exists. And so we want to make sure that we're including identity as part of variability. So before, if you remember, we had the how of learning, the what of learning, the why of learning. That's still there, right? But now we're including the who of learning. And so that's the importance of identity being a part of the guidelines enhancements. We also wanted to acknowledge individuals, institutional, and those systemic barriers that or systemic bias that present themselves as barriers. So oftentimes we looked at barriers in our methods, our materials, our assessments, but now we recognize and want to acknowledge that there are also systemic barriers that prevent students and our learners from engaging in overall learning. The other emphasis is on interdependence and collective learning. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this session, but there is this focus on valuing not just independence, but interdependence, right? And so we heard that loud and clear a lot from our advisory group. The other thing is shifting our language from it being teacher-centered, like that provide terminology, to being more learner-centered and really making sure that we're incorporating learning into the learner, into our choices, our design, to our considerations. And like I mentioned before, the overarching goal of UDL has been expanded to include learner agency and not just expert.
And I'd take a minute here, Shantae, to identify that we're having a webinar on identity. We had a webinar on bias. We're having a webinar on learner agency. So we're coming at this from different angles. So you can kind of choose the angle that works best for you. What's going to make this webinar different. So you might see some of this similar things or when we're talking about bias, but what makes this webinar different and the webinars in this series different as we're trying to really dig into some of that research and kind of me as the practitioner's questions for the researchers like Shantae. So that's kind of where we're coming at it from this time through.
Yes. And I also want to bring your attention to the resources that are at the bottom of this slide. So one of the things that we prided ourselves on, honestly, is really the transparency of the process of the enhancements. And so there are several resources that get into the thoughts and minds, the whys, the hows of the enhancements. And so we wanted to provide that information or resources to you.
And then we talked about this, but the words are bigger on the screen for you. When we talk about learner agency, we are saying learning that is purposeful and reflective, resourceful and authentic, and strategic and action oriented. So, because the goal of UDL is learner agency, we wanted to first dig into that first big bucket of new research that was looked at in order to expand the guidelines: identity. So, identity is key to learner agency. And if you watched our webinar, our Cecil webinar, which is one of our projects, you might have heard some of this before. But as I said, we're going to really dig into the research. So when we're talking about identity, we're talking about it as our sense of self and what makes us unique and has continuity over time. Some of that includes family, cultural, and background, physical features, values, morals, beliefs, and ethics. And to sort of bring that home, prior to CAST, I was first a social worker, then a teacher, and then a principal in alternative high schools in Boston. So those were the high schools for the students who had either dropped out or been pushed out of their home schools for a variety of reasons. One of my students was a immigrant from Africa, and she had immigrated from one part of Africa to another part of Africa to go to a refugee camp, and then came to Boston from that refugee camp. So as you can imagine, she had a lot of interruptions in her schooling. She sort of lost herself and her identity as a learner as she went through that process. And then she came to Boston, and her homeschool told her that they couldn't continue serving her because she had missed too many days. And she missed a lot of days because she had many younger brothers and sisters, and her parents had to work two jobs each to make ends meet in Boston. So she came to us kind of a little bit disenchanted with the schooling process, trying to figure out what it was in school for her, what was there for her. And we gave her some flexibility around how she could manage both her home responsibilities and her school responsibilities. But one thing that I feel like really made a difference for her was when she did a personal narrative project, and she was able to tell her own story of her immigration, her own story from her own perspective. It was in her English class, in her English language arts class. And because so many stories were being told about her, right? Because the people were thinking about, why is this young lady never in school, et cetera, et cetera. So she was able to tell her own story. And through that process, by bringing her whole identity to the learning, she was sort of able to reclaim her identity, not only as a person, as an African, as an older sister, as a woman, but also as a learner and a writer in that process. So that's one way that identity, in my experience, has really enhanced the learning for a young person. What's the research behind that, Shante?
Great. And so one thing that I mentioned before, but I want to reiterate, is that when we had our focus groups and advisory boards, there were many or several themes that emerged. And so what we did was, as themes emerged, we also looked at the research base behind several of those themes. And so there was several literature pieces, right? So not just articles, I should say citations, not just articles, but websites and white papers and a variety of literature, a variety of texts, podcasts, right? That supported many of the themes that resulted from our conversations. And so the slides that I'll be presenting to you are really a representation of those citations that supported those themes. So when we looked at a welcoming interest in identities, we found that Gonzalez and Mull's research of funds of knowledge really did support the development of this principle. So welcoming interest identities, we had folks saying, we want ourselves to be representative. And so funds of knowledge, if you will, are cultural practices that look at how families actually work through their day-to-day, what are their day-to-day activities, and how really, when you bring those activities, those thoughts, those values into the classroom, the impact that it has on student achievement, on student engagement. And so we found that that was an important part of our research. The other thing, and the enhancements. The other thing that popped up a lot is on being culturally responsive. And so we included a citation or citations really from Gloria Latson Billings' work, where she looked at how being culturally responsive and using uh, asset-based culturally responsive pedagogy really does address student achievement. And so we found that this critical perspective and having that asset-based approach really did foster or support much of what the much of what we think is important to consider as we implement the guidelines or as we design learning experiences. And then, of course, in that same vein, culturally responsive pedagogies. Paris and Alim's work really talked about perpetuating students' both cultural and linguistic repertoires, if you will. So what they value, what they emphasize, and how important that is in learning and overarching their overarching learning experiences. The other thing I wanted to mention to you is that all of this can be found on the UDL guidelines. So if you go to UDL guidelines, which I believe has been put in the chat, but Patrice, if you could put that back in the chat, you'll see that each of our checkpoints and considerations have a research page. And so you'll be able to see much of the research that has been used to enhance the guidelines. And those things will be denoted with the asterisks at the following the citations.
So based on that research, these are some of the strategies that you can find when you click. Another place you can click in those UDL guidelines is click on each guideline. It'll give you a little bit of a narrative and some bullet points around what that might look like. So some strategies to help students bring identity to the learning might be a counter narrative project, similar to what my young person did. Self-reflection to content and activities. So self-reflecting on what's going on in the classroom. Creating space for learners to find joy through connections to their identities, sense of selves, communities, maybe some art projects, some sharing, dancing, other things, and allowing multiple ways for students to engage based on their culture. So those are some ideas. There is, I believe we now have the slide deck. So there's a video that we probably won't have time to show you in the slide deck that you can watch by Karen Pittman about letting students lead with their identity. But we wanted to stop for a minute, let you process, and use the chat to let us know either what you're encouraging, how you encourage students to bring their identity to learning. What are some ideas you want to share with your colleagues, or some questions that you might have for us? So take a minute, drop anything in the chat. Peg, I don't know the answer to the question. Patrice might know about the closed webinars. Let's see what else. Any other ideas you might have, Shante, for identity strategies, or how the research links up?
The other thing that is important to note is to mention exactly is the intersectionality of identities. So sometimes we tend to be very monolithic in how we how we support identity, and just remembering that there is no one identity of anyone, right? And so the importance of, like I said, the intersectionality of how individuals identify will also be something that we want to support. So asking questions too is always going to be like my answer to everything. We so want to make sure that we're giving students and learners voice and choice in everything that they do, like as it relates to their learning, as it relates to their processing. And so where there's doubt, where we don't know, question first and listen.
I do see in the chat some people modeling, sharing their own pronouns, ethnic background, choosing topics, so using that choice to support people bringing in their own identities. Um,
Mhm.
Another choice on heroes. Let's see, it's popping now, so I'm trying to catch
Yeah, it
up.
sure is, right?
Sharing our privilege or information about our privilege, moving past surface identity. Thank you for sharing that, Shante. Where can we ask questions, Iona? You can ask it in the chat. Just feel free to drop a question in there. And we'll do our best to answer it either now or later. We'll have a record of the chat. All right, should we move on, Shante? What do we have
We
next?
shall. And I will make note that just like many of you, I am experiencing technical difficulties as well. So I've been popped out twice. So if you don't see me, and just know that I will be right back.
Oh my goodness, I didn't even notice. Believe me, Shante. All right, so our next one is talking about bias. So we must address bias to foster learner agency. We have to address, the biases that we bring. We talked in our bias webinar, if you want to go back to that, about how it's just part of our natural makeup as humans. It's just something that happens, and it's the way our brains are wired. And so, in order to address the impacts of bias, we have to notice when it happens, interrupt it, stop it, and then make a choice, make a different choice. So it's in our and it's in our DNA, it's in our makeup. So one way that happened for one of my students was they were late to school every day, and so they were asked to leave the school and come to a different school, come to our school because they were late to school every day. And they asked him questions like, do you have an alarm clock? Can we get you an alarm clock? Do you want somebody to call you in the morning? Do you want somebody do you need like to set an alarm to make sure you go to bed on time? Are you staying up watching TikToks? Are you staying up watching playing video games? And they were trying to help him solve the problem through that process. He came to us, and we were able to give him first period free so that he could catch up on his studies, second through seventh period. And as we built a relationship with him, what we found was the reason he was coming to school late was because he had violence in his home, and he was staying home to protect somebody and wanted the person who was violent to leave before before he did. And we made all these assumptions. Other people made all these assumptions about why he was late to school based on bias, based on those shortcuts, based on our experiences with other students that start to develop those shortcuts. And this must be why this young person is late to school. So that's why it's important to really stop, interrupt your bias, and really think about asking questions. As Shante said, let's ask some questions. Let's let the students lead.
And as Melissa has alluded to, bias is natural, right? And I think sometimes we have this, we say bias and it's a catch-all phrase. And so one of the things that we really wanted to do, and I'll say this 100 times, one of the things my mentor has suggested is that we be really specific. So what does bias mean? Bias truly is just an inclination or our tendency or preference towards how we think or how we act towards a given person, a group, an idea. Sometimes words can conjure up, emotions, positive or negative. That initial inclination that you have is our bias. We have, excuse me, different types of biases, and one thing that we at least here have been talking about it are our cognitive biases. And so in the previous webinar, we talked about what bias is. We talked about several different biases that exist in as it relates to learning, but we could spend years, if you will, talking about what bias is and how it shows up in learning and in a classroom. And so when you think about a cognitive bias, it's that era. So I don't know if you guys remember that crave with the is this a blue dress or is it a gray dress, right? It's how our minds perceive something. And when we're trying to understand it, we make a decision almost instantly, right? But sometimes it's really an error in how we see it, right? Do you see a picture of a woman or do you see a picture of an old lady? You remember those optical illusions are what they called. And so it's our brain's way of making sense of something of our perceptions that of those things that we're taking in. And so it does allow us to make choices really quickly. But that's the thing. It's a quick decision. And so we don't have, excuse me, the time to take in, to deliberate or to reflect on those things. The research talks about there being over 175 biases, cognitive biases, and there's even more when you step outside of cognitive biases. So one of the first things we do, I say, is to slow down, right? And also knowing how and being aware of our bias and how we are operating within those bias and or assumptions. All right, Melissa. And so what does the research say, y'all? We could again talk forever about the research on bias. And so I want to make sure that we are acknowledging the fact that the research that we've included, again, the enhancements may not speak specifically towards bias, although there are a lot that does, but some of the articles or citations or websites really do support what happens when bias is present. So in this, Loretta Ross talks about how we can address bias in the classroom. So, in her particular article, Speaking Up Without Tearing Down, it's really her as an author talking about how educators might be able to support students when bias comes into play. So, for example, if you have a student who says something that involves bias, says something that is prejudice, says something that is stereotype, what do you do? How do you help students work through calling in and calling out? And so that article is really on how to protect students and their own identities in the classroom if they're being attacked or if they feel like that attack or threat is becoming a distraction to their learning. The next one, Crease's work, Angela Crease, talks about one of the, and this is one of the things that came up in our groups. This whole shift or mindset shift around our multilingual learners. So there have been many instances where multilingual learners um, have been looked at through a deficit lens, and so we want to adjust the language, the perceptions, the thoughts around thinking of multilingual learners from a deficit approach. And so Crease talks about and actually looks at how sociolinguistics look at language and language being only a part of identity, but not equal to. Excuse me. And so one thing for me, I'm always amazed and quite fond of, maybe a little selfishly jealous, that's my own bias, with how multilingual learners are able to take in what they see, process it, and express it, sometimes in multiple language simultaneously, like just the sentences that are like half in one language and half in another. But just how much, at least, from my perspective, that takes, right, to be able to process and understand. But what an asset it is to be able to have that skill where you can bring in multiple perspectives and also give multiple perspectives through language. And the last piece is, or one of the citations I just want to highlight is actually one of our considerations, addressing bias in modes of communication and expression. So we know that there is, and we talked about this in our bias webinar, a propensity to want to do things as we learn. We hold value to things that we experience and hold true and believe to be quote unquote right. And so NCLD, the National Center for Learning Disability, has an article where they talk about the bias that exists in our education system. And this is specifically disproportionality within special education. But one result of the bias and how we assess, how we ask for students to express themselves, how we ask for students to demonstrate what they know, has led to disproportionality of Black and Brown students within special education. So this is a way or a demonstration, evidence of how bias and how bias in the form of modes in communication and expression can be seen or can become an outcome in our education system. And so we want to make sure that we address this, and our guidelines are helping us to do that.
So when we're thinking about addressing it, we want to really consider all those decisions. We make all these decisions as educators throughout the day. We make decisions about materials, methods, assessments, environments. So we want to stop and ask ourselves. Sometimes we call it an equity pause. You just want to stop and ask ourselves, are the materials representative of all the learners and all their perspectives? Do the methods consider various ways of interacting? Does the assessment involve choice of expression relevant to all cultures, similar to that piece that Shantae was saying towards the end there around interrupting that disproportionality by giving different modes of expression? And thinking about who is represented and comfortable and feels like they belong in the environment. So you can stop and ask yourself those questions as you're trying to address bias. And some things to think about when we think about bias in modes of expression. Sometimes our schooling system here in the US believes that learning by reading a physical book is greater than using text to speech software on a digital text. We might give off the impression that we think mental math calculations is greater than jotting or drawing visuals, that writing to demonstrate understanding is greater than speaking, drawing, or using digital media to demonstrate understanding. Arts made with paints greater than digital arts. Working solo is harder, more important than working with others. Or working with others is harder or more important than working solo. And that working without scaffolds is better than working with scaffolds. So, another way to sort of think about when you're designing your lessons and you're designing, think about how do I interrupt or address bias? Think about those ideas, and am I unintentionally giving off these ideas that I think the one is better than the other?
And so, how do we address and really disrupt the bias that comes with us being humans, right? Or what are some anti-bias strategies? First and foremost, practicing mindfulness can make you less biased. So Jill Sudi has um, a, um, a article, if you will, and it's there in that link. It's linked there about how mindfulness can really reduce the that we have, and so it allows us to put ourselves um, to empathize with others from different walks of life with different perspectives. And so once we're able to stop that quick reaction, those quick thoughts, and really take time to slow down and deliberate how our thoughts are impacting our actions and our decisions, then we can really, truly, honestly reduce our bias. It's also important, and I think that's probably all three of the next bullets. Will recognizing that we all have personal bias, and it's not a bad thing, but it's what we do as a result of our bias, and the stereotypes that we create for ourselves and how we walk within those thoughts that does impact and can negatively impact our learners and learning. And so we want to recognize it. We want to acknowledge it. We want to get specific, and we want to be mindful to help reduce it. The other things that we want to be open to is hearing others' perspectives. So, not thinking that our thoughts, our values, our preferences are the right way, right, or the only way, and allowing opportunity for differences to really drive and really help support us as we design learning and learning opportunities. Also practicing responding or asking rather reacting. And I have to admit, I need to do some work in this area because We have to sometimes when we hear something or we see something, again, that bias, our first inclination is to react as opposed to listen, to ask questions, to try to get a deeper and get deeper insight into that other person's why behind what they said, behind what they did, and then looking for barriers in the environment, right? And so we know from being in the UDL space that we oftentimes that we want to look at the environment and how that's impacting our learner, and not looking at barriers specifically within the learners themselves. So our question to you is, how do you address bias in learning? How do you address bias in designing learning experiences for the learners that you support? So we'd love for you to incorporate or give us some of those things in the chat, and we'll move forward.
Yeah. As we, as the chat starts to populate, Shantae, it is my understanding, and maybe you can let me know, how close I am in terms of the research,
Okay,
that the more that you start to ask questions and you start to hear other people's opinions and you start to spend time thinking about things from different people's perspectives, the more it is going to route your neural pathways
that's
such that
exactly right.
that knee-jerk reaction is not going to be as prevalent.
That's right. And so we even have one of the considerations that talks about cultivating empathy, right? And so that allows us to um, see see those different perspectives, but like you said, develop those thoughts, develop those spaces, and start to think about, yes, how we can align ourselves to or appreciate, if you will, other perspectives.
Yeah. Cool. I dropped those things in the chat. Let's see, I got one new message here. Um,
Uh,
Conversation is greater than thank you, Dan. He's using our sentence stem.
yeah,
Conversation is greater than outing, shaming, and correcting. Absolutely. Thank
love
you.
it.
Nice. Uh, we got some comments about ESL or ethnicity when discussing culture. Disability is also a culture and community of people with unique perspectives. Thank you for calling that out. Hope, thank you. Nice. Thank you for all your comments. So feel free to keep responding to each other in the chat. I'm going to move us on so that we can get through all three of these in time. And so we're moving on to the collective learning, Shante.
All right. And so one of our uh, the highlights or conceptual changes, enhancements has been on collective learning. And I remember when I was in the classroom, and I'm a special educator. And so at the time I was pushing in and pushing out, if you will, pushing in and pushing out. And I had a student who was in one of my resource classes who was an avid illustrator. I mean, every thought that he had was perpetuated, if you will, through his art. So, and I'm dating myself. I was telling Melissa this earlier that he used to use an etch a sketch, which just in that and of itself amazed me that he was able to express himself so clearly in his illustration. And in talking with him and talking to his teacher, we talked about the fact that he was having a difficult time with group work in the sense that he didn't feel like he belonged when collaboration or group work was happening. The teacher often complained, or his general education teacher often complained about his involvement with the group work. And so I asked her, because I do this so well, asking questions, right? What type of things are you asking him to do? And so she said, well, I assign roles, and everyone knows what they're supposed to do. And so we looked at the roles, and it was things like, fill in the graphic organizer, or write your summary, or be the timekeeper. And so what we found, as you could imagine, was that wasn't his preference, right? That wasn't his preference. That was not what he felt like he was good at. That was not the way to excel. And so what we did was we looked at the roles and we did things like, summarizing, and you did options. You had options for being able to express yourself. We had illustrator oftentimes. And then we provided a agency piece in there, which was having students actually be able to choose which role they wanted to play within the group work. And so, as you can imagine, not only did he excel in participation, but he actually began to learn those harder concepts because he had the opportunity to communicate with his student, to communicate with his peers, and to learn within a more community rich
Mhm.
environment.
And I hear in that story, Shantae, that interdependence that is part of the new guidelines, not just, protocols for group work and
That's right.
collaboration, but this interdependence. We're counting on this individual to get us our illustrations. We're counting on each
Absolutely.
other to
That's right.
build a better product.
That's right. There's a level of shared accountability in
Yeah.
that model. And so some of the examples and themes that popped up within our research, and this is actually a quote from one of our advisory board, was, we want students to be learning and building together, right? We want them to have the opportunity to share their stories. And so, not only did we have the research, but we have quotes, right, from our community. So one of the some of the citations, or some of the literature that I wanted to highlight for collective learning was, first and foremost, the need to fully embrace, as Melissa said, interdependence, not just independence. And this was an amazing article around the Ubuntu style pedagogy, which is a pedagogy from a Southern African country of Namibia, where they had a very diverse, very, very diverse culture, in the sense of the country was separated, and then once they got their independence, they were able to brought back together. So just a rich tapestry of cultures that they wanted to make sure was really represented in their educational system. And so they developed a pedagogy that supported community learning and being culturally responsive in their education approach. So this this article is amazing to give you a very global or international perspective on what it means to be culturally responsive. Another citation that I wanted to highlight was that of Espinoza et al., which looked at meaningful participation and what they titled educational dignity, and how important interdependence within a community is in enhancing learning. So that involvement in learning, the right to learn, and the importance of autonomy when you're learning to foster true involvement in participation in learning. And the last one that I wanted to highlight was, there was this, a lot actually, individuals who were amongst our advisory and focus groups who self-identified as having disabilities and intersectionalities, with one of those identities being a disability, and talking about this overemphasis, I think, in the Western culture of independence. And so what they were saying was that I solely am not my disability, first and foremost. That's a part of who I am. But also, when I learn in isolation, I don't have the breadth or the depth of learning that I do when I'm in a community. If I am isolated, if I am separated, if I am excluded from true learning, when I get back into the environment where my peers are, then I don't have that same agency, right? Or sometimes I feel like the opportunity is not there for me to say have that same agency. And so we want to focus on that interdependence with that importance of community learning. Some of the benefits of collective learning, as you probably could glean from our conversation, is that the shared responsibility of being able to work together and seeing each other's, capitalizing on each other's strengths and interests and varying perspectives. Again, we just come to the world and everything we do with our own experiences, and that's great, but that can only carry us but so far. Like, it's important to make sure that we are open and that we have an understanding of multiple points of views and expertise, because that's going to make us that's going to expand even our own perspectives and thoughts. Communication skills, so when we are working with other people, we learn how to communicate with others, right? Because someone will say, I don't understand what you're saying, and so we can develop those communication skills as we're working towards a common goal. The other piece is that critical thinking. And so we want to make sure, again, that we are having opportunities to gain insights and discuss and ask questions as it relates to a particular issue, but it helps us look through multiple lenses of problem solving. Again, if it's just you only have those lenses that you bring when you need to solve a problem. So having being in a collective learning environment allows us to have multiple approaches to solving issues or concerns that may be presented with.
So for our collective learning strategies, we have collaborative group work, think, pair, share, jigsaw, problem solving, gallery walks, interactive digital platforms. And we wanted to ask you what strategies you use. We only have a few minutes left, but go ahead and populate the chat with that. And then we have a video that you can also watch. We also have some resources to support you. So there's graphic organizers in 6 different languages, research pages, FAQs, the changes. There's a changes document where you can kind of follow along what changed from 2.2 to 3.0. Um, there's a rationale document to describe each update, and we're going to dig more into that, into each of the principles as we go forward. So please feel free to put in the chat all the ideas and questions you have that you want us to address in the next 4. There's a slide here. If you want to know about professional learning services at CAST, you can email pl@cast.org. We also have a school-wide implementation leadership workshop series coming up. It's going to be, I think, about 9 sessions from October 3rd to June 5th. So that's something you can find on our website. And lastly, we just wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect on today, what affirmed your thinking, what pushed your thinking, and what might your learners need you to do next. And before we close in the last 30 seconds, I did get a private chat that with concern that the story about the young man who had violence in his home, there was the picture of a young man of color as representing that. And I did not
Mhm.
intend to reinforce stereotypes. I was looking for a picture that represented the community of learners that I serve. So I apologize. And
Mhm.
I'm publicly um, holding myself accountable for the impact that that may have had on people.
And I too want to note that correction was made in my language as well. I said a Eurocentric approach as opposed to a Western way of thinking. And so I do want to acknowledge that, yes, that could be that a Western approach would be more appropriate for that that statement. And again, one of our biases, right? First,
Yep.
acknowledgement, awareness, but also recognize intent was not our intent. However, the fact that it impacted others is important for us to be able to stop and call it out and to really listen to how it impacted and affected others. So thank you for that, and we appreciate you all feeling comfortable for presenting that information to us.
And that's what the 3.0 is all about, right? We went to the
That's exactly
field,
right.
we got feedback, and we're going to continue to grow.
I also wanted to make it to acknowledge. I know we're at time. Just the fact that a lot of the group work uh, neglected, or we should have flexible options for students where group work may pose as barriers. So thank you for that.
Yes. All right, we'll see you next time at our changes to the engagements.
Thank you all. We
Yes, well,
appreciate
thank
that.
you, everybody. Hope to see you back. Thank you.